What is missing or failing to comply and enforce international environmental law? I'm Lionel Chami, and I will be your moderator for this session. We will start by introducing the speakers. The first speaker is Najat Saliba. Najat Saliba is an award-winning scientist and professor of chemistry at the American University of Beirut. She is the founder of two organizations, Khadd Beirut and the Environment Academy. She is one of the leading voices for environmental justice in Lebanon, and we are delighted to have her among us today. Najat, environmental justice is a fairly common expression these days. Given your experience, what is the meaning that you ascribe and the link you make between environmental justice and the rule of law?
So can I give my presentation first, or would you like
Absolutely.
me to answer? Thank you. So good evening, everyone. I would like to give you examples of when and how the rule of law, the rule of survival, or the rule of common good works best. In 2020, all rules stopped, and only the rule of common good prevailed. In 2021, the effects of climate change, biodiversity loss, and environmental disasters became more visible than ever. What rule should prevail? From global to local, problems manifesting themselves have a lot in common. That's why I would start with a local example and then extend to the global problem. Lebanon has relied on development finances forever, for the longest time. The amount of money has tripled in 2006 because of the Israeli-Lebanese war, and in 2010 because of the war in Syria. The amount Lebanon has received has reached its utmost high of $2.1 billion around 2014. This money is divided between the government, UN systems, NGOs, private sector, and donor agencies. The money has been allocated for quality education, reducing inequalities, for zero hunger, clean water and sanitation, and good health, among others. And in 2018, the government went to Paris and held the Sadr conference, where they asked for $20 billion more, assuming that their strategy will need to support transport, electricity, water and irrigation, and wastewater. And yet, the problems are only exacerbating. During COVID-19, we adopted 5 schools, and we looked at them to see if they are ready to do online learning. Among the 5 schools, only 17% had computers. The others didn't. Out of the 1964 students that we surveyed, only 6% of them had laptops, 94% did not. There was no computer lab in any of the schools, and among the teachers, out of the 179 teachers, only 49% of them had laptops. The others gave lessons on WhatsApp. And for clean water, the Litani River, one of the main rivers in Lebanon, is one of the most polluted in the world. Only a few months ago, people woke up to see 40,000 tons of dead fish on the surface of the water. And still, our health is threatened on a daily basis because there is no electricity provided by the government. This shortage of electricity is compensated by the humming of diesel generators spread all over the city. And the garbage crisis that came to the surface in 2015, and since 1970, the government did not come up with any strategic plan to look into the garbage crisis. All their solutions were patching up with landfills and sea reclaimed land. And to top it all off, there was the Beirut explosion on August 4, 2020, which was the epitome of negligence and carelessness. In one container, there was 3,000 tons of ammonium nitrate, stored alongside fireworks, tires, tons of coffee, and tea. The Beirut explosion was estimated to be equivalent to 640 tons of TNT, very similar to 5% of the Hiroshima bomb. 1 month later, a fire broke out in the port. Residents panicked, not knowing whether to close their windows to avoid inhaling the smoke or keep them open to prevent the shattering of glass in the event of an explosion. Living with a complete distrust in the government's ability to protect its own residents, this panic moment became our new normal. We woke up the second day with no procedure or standard to deal with the aftermath of the Beirut explosion. Grains in the silos were left open in the winter and in the summer, with no disposal plan in sight. Old metal and concrete structures leading to mountains of rubble containing asbestos. Demolition and damaged building and construction activities cause major dust suspension in the air. People rushed to help with no clear guidelines and safety instructions. There was no roadmap for recovery. Glass and metal are shattered everywhere in the city. 70,000 homes and businesses were badly affected in 2 of the major touristic and inclusive streets. 4 hospitals were completely destroyed and 12 others affected. 163 schools were damaged by the blast. Of course, people protested, even before the blast, because of the trash and because of other corruption. And people even demanded fraud investigation because they were seeing all of this funding not going anywhere. Still, no corrective actions were taken. The local government continues corrupt business as usual. Other governments are trying to look for their gains amidst the crisis. The rule of law failed. We started looking elsewhere to see what other countries are doing. And we soon realized that we are not the only place in the world where science, dignity, and human life are pushed back by partisan politics. Of course, people are talking about election, but regardless of who wins an election, in many parts of the world, people's lives and dignity remain at risk. What we learned is we are stuck in a cycle. Civil resistance has been largely linear, people against politicians, and targeting the same group, using the same tools that is protesting, from Chile to Poland to Hong Kong to Beirut, and with limited influence. Protests usually end in 2 ways. Either people win and dictatorships dissolve, and that's very few cases, or political system wins, people go to jail, die, or lose their rights, and this is what's prevalent. Political systems remain in power. People lose trust and hope for a change. Demotivated and helpless, the country plunges into poverty. Humanitarian aids rush into the country to serve the most vulnerable, but this is always a passive attitude instead of an active approach. The rule of survival failed. A new model of transformational change must be taken place. We have to break this cycle. Resistance and protests to build a state may not have worked, but constructive resistance to build an alternative community has already started. Constructive resistance is when people start to build the society they desire independently of the dominant structures already in place. What people need in the present moment is what matters to them now. Future promises are no longer appealing to people. With people engagements and mobilization, we would like to break the cycles of dependencies, clientelism, and economic gain at the expenses of climate justice and the common good. Yes, we have started, and here in Beirut, with the Environment Academy and Khaddit Beirut, we look at the local community issues. The context is important. And then we work with them to co-produce knowledge and co-create solutions. We look at every problem from many angles because one profession or one discipline cannot solve the problem. And then together, while we're here and remain here, we build trust over time. Our presence is not contingent to any amount of funding or presence, temporary presence. When we need the local public authorities will pull on their effort. And everything we do, we share our local experiences with the global community. Here is an example of Environment Academy 1, where we worked on 10 environmental projects with 10 different communities. Those 10 environmental projects can be clean water, solid waste management, forest fire prevention, and others. And because of the success of the first Environment Academy, this year we have 12 projects spanning from the extreme north to the extreme south, and all vital environmental problems that, if they're not fixed, they are affecting the livelihood of the community. One example is this beautiful village that we visited last weekend. They don't have an infrastructure for the sewage line, and their sewage is actually threatening all their crops. The community is engaged. The community is empowered. The community is driving the change. The rule of the common good wins. The rule of law works where a trusted government has put the environment as one of the country's priorities. It is, however, limited by the country's agenda and its own boundaries. The rule of survival works in disaster zones. The narrative, however, focuses on humanitarian aids, which is counterproductive. The rule of the common good is breaking the cycles of dependencies and clientelisms by empowering the community with evidence so that the community becomes the agent of the needed change. I want to thank you.
Thank you, Najat, for this harrowing presentation of the situation in Lebanon, especially how it reflects the disproportion or the gap between promises that are made on the international level and how things are actually going on the national level, and the disregard that governments, or specifically the government of Lebanon, has towards the rights of its people. Now, I think one of the really important things in this panel is that we have different perspectives coming on. So just after, we have Jan de Venis, who's a human rights lawyer, a human rights and rights of nature lawyer in the Netherlands. He's the chairman of Stand Up For Your Rights, a Dutch NGO that focuses on environmental justice, and the Crowd versus the National Park Dunes of Texel. And perhaps most importantly, he acts as the Dutch acting ombudsperson for future generations. So I think a beautiful perspective that Jan van de Venis could present is, given his experience in the Netherlands, how is it possible to enforce these rights that are being neglected in Lebanon on the national level in another country, to have a comparative perspective on the same issue? Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lionel, and thanks all speakers for such beautiful presentations, and thanks for everybody for being here. I understand many people are in the room today listening to the important talks, and the question asked to me was, how can we enforce the right to environment? And many people then think about a carrot and a stick, and they think about the stick. The stick is used for enforcement. But I will also show you that we should also use the carrot, like the ombudsperson for future generations, or developing tools for future generations in our society. So I work a lot on environmental justice, on cases in the Netherlands. For instance, I was a member of the expert committee on the Shell case, the case against Shell, that many of you know that was won. I do cases on air pollution, impacting children, noise pollution, earthquakes in our province of Groningen. So we think the Netherlands is a beautiful place and everything is perfect, but it's far from that. And why is that? And that is part of the enforcement of the right to environment. First of all, the Netherlands didn't acknowledge this right to a healthy environment. And in short, my presentation today will be, we need to use it. We need to use the right to environment. The second point is, we shouldn't focus on lawsuits, but if we need to, we have to go to court and force our governments to act. Third point, we need to connect the agendas. There's so many agendas. It's not just the right to a healthy and clean environment, but there's rights of nature and many others which I will address. And last but not least, governance. Governments must act. It's a governance issue. There are clear positive obligations based on human rights. They shouldn't wait. They shouldn't stall. They shouldn't say it's politics. It's about human rights. So first, we should use it. And what I mean is by we should use it is that we should include future generations, not only in the sub-articles when we say we have a right to a healthy, clean, and stable or sustainable environment, but it must say for present and future generations. Because if we start to act for the future generations, we start to act today. Air pollution in the Netherlands already damages the brains of children that are still in the womb in their mother. So the impact of future generations is there. So making things better immediately improves things for adults, for children, and for future generations. And our treaties, so the climate agreement, the Paris Agreement talks about intergenerational equity, but not about the rights of future generations. The Sustainable Development Goals, nope. The UN just acknowledged the right to a healthy and clean environment. It's not in the text for present and future generations. But in many countries, in many constitutions, it is. And this is also why I think it was so important. In Germany, it was added to the constitutional text. And this is why it was won at the Supreme Court. So include future generations in the texts. Include it into new institutions. We have a Welsh Commissioner for Future Generations, a Hungarian Ombudsman for Future Generations. We need institutions for future generations. I act as the Ombudsperson for Future Generations. This is an NGO initiative, and we are making waves in the Netherlands, creating new tools, new initiatives, new ways of how you can take along in the interest of future generations. But we also need institutions, and there is talk now that we will have a new UN envoy on future generations, which is a great thing. But also our national human rights institutions should work on the right to environment and including the future generations. Why do I say this? For instance, my Dutch national human rights institutions in Geneva, at Ganri, promises the most beautiful things. They say, they sign things, they go along, but back home, there is no NHRI research in the Netherlands on the air pollution of Tata Steel, on the situation of water pollution in the river, on climate change, where it's the people and the children going to the streets. It remains an old-fashioned non-discrimination NHRI. And this, it's not the time, it's not the age. We should have them act on that. CSR laws, there should be better CSR laws. Many countries like the Netherlands adopt beautiful resolutions in Geneva. When they have their universal periodic reviews, they say, yes, we are sure we have to limit businesses from violating human rights of people, but they don't bring it home. There are just a few couple of countries that have good CSR, corporate social responsibility laws that implement the human rights and business agenda, a big gap. And we should use new elements in law. At the Urgenda climate case in the Netherlands, which is world famous because it was the world's first biggest one that was won, the judge said in the first instance, if we know we have to act and it's beneficial for future generations that we act today, and it's not disproportionately expensive that we act today, we must act based on the fairness principle towards future generations. So we must claim these rights, and we must put these rights in our laws. We shouldn't leave it up to the judges to make this. As I said, lawsuits should not be necessary, but they work. On the other hand, they also do not work because they create this political debate. Who are in charge? Is it politics or is it judges? Well, it's human rights, and human rights were signed by our countries many decades ago. They are still explained and under development, and they should be implemented in any country with any political majority. So it should be stressed that people in power also have to realize the rights of people that did not vote for them. I had a talk about a week ago with the committee of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, so the Child's Rights Committee, UN Child Rights Committee, on the situation in the Netherlands. And I said, one of the biggest problems, and this is one of the major issues, is that politicians don't see it, but public servants don't know it. So there's a huge governance gap in education. Public servants do not use human rights when they start an assessment. Yes, they can do an environmental impact assessment, but what about the human rights impact assessment? What about a future generations impact assessment? It's easily done, and it will prevent many things from going wrong. And I talked to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and they said this would actually be so beneficial, and I hope they will write a recommendation on it. But this is for everybody here. It should be a matter of the state, of provinces or local governments and city governments to work actively on human rights. And then I say we need to link the agendas. There's the human rights in the environment, the human rights in business, there's the human rights and the rights of nature agenda, there's the ecocide agenda, there's the justice for future generations agenda, there's the UN harmony with nature agenda. These need to be linked. The UN Committee on Human Rights, so the UN Human Rights Committee, 3 years ago proclaimed environmental degradation, unsustainable development, and climate change are amongst the most pressing issues when it comes to the right to life of present and future generations. And I say it's not just the right to life. It's over 10 human rights that are impacted. So this must start to work. And then the committee continued, and it says countries need to take their international obligations under environmental law, which is very much what we talk about today as well, and inform it towards their obligations under human rights law. And it must take its obligations under human rights law and inform it on the international environmental law. And I recently used that in a case which is about air pollution in a World Heritage site where new jet fighters will make a lot of noise, and the government forgot to include human rights, and it totally forgot the rights of nature, the rights of the animals that live in this pristine natural area. The time has come to start to link all these topics. We cannot look away and just choose one topic. It's in the interest of our future generations that we act today, and so we must ensure that these ethics, these values, stop being moral imperatives, but become legally binding rules. And this also means we have to take these rules and take them and step into our societies, not just by bashing on the outside, but actually talking to the NHRI. Why do you not work on the right to environment in relation to water pollution and air pollution in the Netherlands? Talk to politicians, talk to public servants, and tell them you can. This is not I'm not being an advocate or an activist. No, you can. You have to realize human rights. And it's clear, the European Court of Human Rights was very clear in its cases that countries need to include human rights when it comes to danger, environmental danger, in the whole process. So when they give a permit, when they monitor a permit, and when they enforce a permit, and they just do not. So I can only say, stand up for your rights and use those rights. And I hope our future generations will be thankful. Because last but not least, Judge Veeramantri, the Vice President of the International Court of Justice, who was a huge leader on the rights of future generations, he said, humans have become a force of nature, and we negatively impact the planet that we live on. We don't have a right to create the future of our future generations, but we have the obligation to prevent that we negatively impact their future, their generation. So we have the duty to ensure that future generations are still allowed to freely choose their today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan. This was really enlightening. I love the contrast you made between the beautiful promises made on one hand at the international level and the struggle to get people's right, recognized and enforced at domestic level, and especially the need to harmonize all these points and agendas that are going on between rights of nature, right to a healthy environment, and all these rights and principles going on. And it's really interesting that you make the link, that you make apparent the contrast and but also the similarities between all these things. And I think that's a point that perhaps our next speaker could, tackle a bit more and go a bit further into how can we tackle this contrast at the international level. So our next speaker is Madam Deborah Berman. Deborah Berman is a Canadian environmental activist, campaigner, and writer. She is the International Program Director at Stand Earth, the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Committee. She is also an adjunct professor of York University Faculty of Environmental Studies and has been advising governments on climate policy and designing environmental advocacy campaigns for over 20 years. Deborah, we're glad to have you on board. We live in a crazy world, as you said it, a world of contrasts between North and South, between promises and acts. Global warming is at its height. Environmental justice has seldom been as needed. I have it on a good source that you have a revolutionary proposal to tackle this, something called the Fossil Fuel Treaty. Could you tell us more about it?
Thank you so much, Lionel. I'd love to. And I'm really honored to be at this important gathering. I'm speaking to you today from the unceded territory of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, and the Musqueam First Nations here in Vancouver, Canada. So my research for the past many years now, over a decade, has been looking at fossil fuel production. As someone who was advising several subnationals on climate policy in Canada, I was trying to understand how, even though we had some very progressive governments that wanted to address climate change and put in good climate policy, carbon pricing and significant policy, Canada's emissions just continued to go up and not down. And I started looking at issues around emissions reductions versus the production of fossil fuels. What I realized in my research is that our governments have been regulating emissions, while behind our backs, the fossil fuel industry has been growing production significantly. We don't currently have any international agreements or even very much domestic policy that addresses constraining the production and supply of fossil fuels. So that's where our initiative really starts, is the missing framework internationally, so that we can not only stop the growth of fossil fuel production that stands in the way of us meeting our climate goals, but also that we can create a framework for international cooperation, because there are many human rights, equity, and justice issues embedded in this continued growth of fossil fuel production. I'm wondering if someone could start my slides and I'll introduce you to the treaty. Thank you. So our work at the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty focuses on this question of fossil fuel supply and how incompatible the continued growth of production is for a safe future. Failing to manage the phase out of fossil fuel production not only means that climate goals won't be met, but workers and vulnerable communities around the world who are dependent on production for their livelihoods risk facing the sudden loss of income and livelihoods when their projects become unviable due to failing demand. And of course, the drop in the price of renewable energy around the world in most countries now cheaper than fossil fuels, which is a good thing. But if we don't coordinate who gets to produce and how much, if we don't negotiate that, then we will have an unmanaged decline instead of a managed decline, and more people will suffer. So against this background, the treaty initiative's mission is to create a globally coordinated plan for a global just transition away from fossil fuels, one that is feasible, one that is fair, and aligned with meeting the Paris Agreement goals. Next slide, please. The World Economic Forum report shows that the exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius is a risk equivalent or greater to weapons of mass destruction. In fact, in 2020, climate action failure topped weapons of mass destruction as the most likely and greatest risk facing global security today. And it was really in looking at that report and thinking about that report that we started to really make the analogy to nuclear nonproliferation. Next slide, please. So climate policy and agreements are complicated, but what's not complicated and what's actually very simple is that 86% of the emissions trapped in our atmosphere today come from 3 products. Next slide. Oil, gas, and coal. So for decades, governments have been negotiating emissions and targets, but the production of oil, gas, and coal has been dramatically increasing. Next slide. It's important that we're talking today because just today, a new report was released by the United Nations Environment Programme, the Stockholm Environment Institute, and other partners. It's the 3rd such report that they've released since 2019. Many of you here, of course, will be familiar with the emissions gap. The production gap report shows that we are currently on track to produce 110% more fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal, in the next decade than we can ever burn if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees. So let me say that again. Our governments are currently planning to produce more than twice the amount of fossil fuels in 2030 than would be consistent with limiting 1.5 degrees. So we're currently using our intellectual, our financial, our technical capital on the planet to dig up and produce more fossil fuels than we could ever burn, or it will burn us. So shockingly, the report also shows us that G20 countries have directed about $300 billion in new funds towards growing fossil fuel activities just since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide. So what we know from this research is even if coal was phased out overnight, existing oil and gas projects alone would push us above 1.5 degrees. So how could this be happening? For decades, climate policy and agreements have been designed on a theory that we reduce demand, that we increase the price of carbon, and the markets will constrain supply. But it's not working, not fast enough to keep us safe. In large part because the markets are distorted by tax breaks and fossil fuel subsidies, and because of the power and the influence of the fossil fuel industry, who all really are working to try and ensure that they're the last barrel sold. The industry itself, of course, understands that we need to wind down production, but they'd all like someone else to do it. And many of them are holding out hope that new technologies like carbon capture and storage, which are not yet cost competitive at scale, are not yet available and working at scale, can justify continued expansion of fossil fuel production. We can't let that happen. And that's why we can simply not leave this to the markets, and we have to hold governments to account. Next slide, please. So just in the last 3 months, all of the science has aligned to show us and reinforce this theory of change. The International Energy Agency now acknowledges that there's no need for new investment in fossil fuel supply in a net zero pathway. Next slide. The IPCC sounded a death knell for coal and fossil fuels and said no new expansion of fossil fuel projects is consistent with 1.5. Next slide. But shockingly, I honestly will never forget the day when I searched the Paris Agreement for the words oil, gas, coal, fossil fuels, trying to understand what frameworks exist for international cooperation to stop the production of fossil fuels and this lock-in of future emissions. What I found is that the words don't even exist. They don't appear, not even once, in the world's climate agreement. The fossil fuel industry has been successful in making itself invisible, and we don't currently have any frameworks for negotiating who gets to produce, what fossil fuels, and how much, even though we know that these three products are the three products that threatened human life and climate stability. Next slide, please. Underlying all of our work is the theory of change that given the scale of the challenge and the urgency, and the fact that many countries face capacity constraints, they can't undertake a transition on their own, that there is a need for international cooperation. This chart, well, you can't really see it, the details on your slide, is an important reference to critical work that's being done at Stockholm Environment Institute on the equity principles that must underlie production decline. We're hard at work using those principles to create principles behind the treaty. Because the fact is, while there's no doubt that all fossil fuel producing countries face major challenges, if you look at countries like the US or Canada and the UK, who are on the left of the chart, not only do they have much more diversified economies so that they aren't as dependent on oil revenues for their taxation or for the provision of government services, they also have much higher GDP per capita, which indicates a greater capacity to transition away from fossil fuels. By contrast, countries like Azerbaijan, Iraq, Congo, Timor are far more dependent on fossil fuels for government revenue. They have a lower capacity for transition. Some countries like Ecuador are drilling for new oil right now in the heart of the Amazon, in indigenous territories where there is opposition from indigenous leaders to that new oil drilling and opening up the Amazon to more fires just to feed their debt. So there is literally no way that many countries can stop the expansion of fossil fuel production without new negotiations that also include debt forgiveness and international cooperation. And there, of course, is an urgency to this, especially in high biodiversity regions like the Amazon. So there's a need for support and for international agreement around which countries will be able to phase out their fossil fuels, first based on principles of equity and capacity. Next slide. And this chart shows a similar trade-off between the level of challenge and capacity to transition, but expressed in terms of dependency of a country's workforce on one issue, coal mining. As you can see, Australia is somewhere in the middle in terms of dependence, but right near the top in terms of capacity. These charts just serve to demonstrate that it is a vastly complicated challenge that will need to be managed quickly as well as equitably, and we will need more tools to address this challenge quickly. A new international agreement on fossil fuels can create obligations and set global norms around the need to end expansion and phase out fossil fuels. It will ensure greater transparency around fossil fuel reserves and production plans. Currently, there is no way for us to see and hold accountable countries for what they plan to produce of fossil fuels. So we are now at work creating a global registry of fossil fuel production and reserves because it doesn't currently exist. This will provide support for a global just transition, clear transparency, and accountability. Next slide, please. The three pillars that we're designing the treaty on are based on the analogy for nuclear nonproliferation. End phase out. First of all, ending the expansion and proliferation. Second of all, phasing down global disarmament. And third, the peaceful transition, fast-tracking real solutions through scaled-up access to renewable energy and a just transition for every worker, community, and country. Next slide, please. So the good news is that momentum is growing for the idea of a fossil fuel treaty. We already have 101 Nobel laureates, including the Dalai Lama, that have endorsed the call. Next slide. Cities from around the world are passing motions at city councils to endorse the call, similar to nuclear nonproliferation. This is a movement that is being built from the ground up. Cities played an incredibly important role in convincing nation states to move towards nuclear nonproliferation. We've already seen motions pass: Sydney, Barcelona, Los Angeles, Vancouver, Toronto, and more. Next slide. Over the past 6 months, over 2,000 scientists have endorsed the call for a non-proliferation treaty and the principles behind a treaty. Next slide. And just recently, over 100 elected officials, so members of parliament from over 20 countries, have endorsed the call for the principles of a fossil fuel treaty, and that list is growing. Next slide. Indigenous leaders, youth groups, over 800 civil society groups from around the world have endorsed the call. These groups, many of them, have been fighting fossil fuel projects in their communities for decades. Now they are calling on their countries to negotiate a new treaty to keep fossil fuels in the ground. This is a movement that's growing. It's not only a movement, but a research initiative and a diplomatic initiative to socialize the concept with countries and to begin to look at what are the barriers to expansion and what are the key components of an international agreement that will be essential in order to stop the expansion of fossil fuels and put all of our energy at this critical time in our history towards building solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah. That was really enlightening on the role of fossil fuels in creating the climate crisis, and also about our inadequacy, or rather the inadequacy of international law and policy to tackle this very issue of the source of climate change, which is the extraction and the burning of fossil fuels. To tackle this issue on the level of international law, we have another speaker who hails from Portugal, Paulo Magalhães. He's the founder and director of the Common Home of Humanity. He's a jurist and a researcher at the SIGE Center for Legal and Economic Research at the University of Porto. And he will be addressing new concepts in lawmaking in the Anthropocene to tackle this issue that we've all been talking about since the beginning of this seminar. So, Paulo, today we've heard various perspectives from the previous speakers. We've talked about environmental justice, we've talked about the right to a healthy environment, and we've talked about the destructive role of fossil fuels in causing climate change. Now, how do you think these new concepts in lawmaking are going to tackle these issues that we've talked about in a comprehensive way?
Thank you so much, Lionel. Thank you so much for the invitation also. It's very interesting that I talk after Tsepora. I don't know if I'm spelling very well the name of the previous speaker, but the previous speaker talked about structural problems, for example, also in Paris Agreement. And we have a big problem that was never solved in international law, that is climate. Because climate is different, is not a territorial good, or is the object of international law. So this is a new problem that must have new approaches and new solutions. We can try to have practice, but we need to connect the theories with practice, because it's a so big problem to make practice without theories as it is to make theories without practice. So I will ask for the first slide to start the presentation to talk about something that usually is not addressed on the climate policy, that is given as something that is given for granted. Okay, so please, the first slide, because this is really to talk about the legal status of climate. When the issue of climate change enter in the UN agenda, the first question is, what is climate from a legal standpoint? I don't know if the slide is coming, and this is a new question for international law, because if we can abstractly divide the airspace or abstractly divide the sea, we cannot divide the climate. We cannot divide the chemical composition of the atmosphere. We cannot divide the chemical composition of the sea. So the concept to consider the planet from a legal standpoint only as a territory divided between states, where the global commons are only the leftovers, the territorial leftovers of this division, is not able to explain the complexity and the functionality of their system. Okay, so law, as Professor Luis Coetzee have already explained, can make evolutions, must be able to explain the reality. The legitimacy of law comes from its ability to explain reality. If we do not make one evolution of law that still look to the planet as it was looking 500 years ago, we will not have the structural conditions to address this question. We will not have the structural conditions to have a collective action. Please, the next slide. The next slide, please. Okay, so climate was subversive to international law. The great question is that climate is truly the common, a global common in the real world, in the natural world. We cannot divide it. We cannot divide, we can, as I have explained, we can divide airspace, we cannot divide climate. But because climate is not a territorial good, we do not accept yet that we have a global common that spans across borders, and there is no borders. So the first person to talk about this, to consider climate as an intangible natural resource, was Simon Borg in 2009. And I will try to explain why a stable climate is intangible from a legal standpoint. Please, the next slide. A stable climate is the way, it's not matter, is the way how matter circulates, moves around the planet. And this is mainly the outcome of the thermodynamics, the laws of thermodynamics. So when we are talking about a stable climate, we are talking about the pattern of stability of how energy and matter moves around the planet. So this pattern is intangible. And law has many objects of law that are intangible and are on the base of the organization of our society. The question is, if in law, and even in international law, in space, outer space law, we have already recognized intangible goods in nature, why can't we recognize that the support of life on Earth is an intangible good that belongs to everyone and to all generations and must be managed as a common good? And this is, it will make a lot of difference in how we address climate change, as we will see. Please, the next slide. So the question in many papers, in many papers of science and law, people talk about climate change as a tragedy of commons in a global scale. The question, because this common good exists inside and outside all the sovereignties, we do not accept that we have a common good inside my sovereignty and inside all the sovereignties, and do not accomplish the rules of the territorial division. For so, we avoid to accept a common good, because the management of the successful management of a common good must have rules for provision and appropriation. And in Paris Agreement, there is no congruence between the rules of appropriation of the common good and the provision of the common good. Please, the next slide. When, as I have told before, when the issue of climate change in the United Nations, the first proposal to address for a legal status for climate was to consider it as a common heritage of humankind. If this proposal that comes from Malta was accepted in 1988, it was one of the most great revolutions in international law, because if this proposal was accepted, it was, for the first time, we are set to have something in common that exist inside and outside all the borders around the planet. But because we do not accept this, we do not accept that we have a common good that exists in the real world, we invent another subsidiary or derivative solution to avoid to accept a common good inside and outside all the sovereignties. Please, the next slide. Climate today, or to be more precisely, the climate change is considered as a common concern of humankind. It's very interesting because what we are lefting for the next generation is not a heritage, is a concern, is the first concept. And this concern, because we do not accept, nobody knows very well what are the rights and duties that come from that concern. Please, the next slide. The next slide, please. Yeah. When this concept of common concern of humankind born, there was a big hope on that concern, but the fathers of that concern, as it was Mustafa Kemal, that was also one of the main or the pioneers of all the political environmental in UN, said clearly in 1991 that this concept needs to be more developed for further elaborate and make its contents and scope understandable and clear. It is also important to make sure that how this concept can be interpreted in terms of rights and obligations of the states. Until today, this work of defining what are the rights and obligations of the states that arise from that concept still not clear. Nobody knows very well what the concern of humankind is. Please, the next slide. The question is that in Paris Agreement, in the preamble of Paris Agreement, climate change is also a common concern of humankind. This means that we are worried about something. The international community is worried about something. So the solution is we will try to make less emissions. And this is very interesting because we only talk about emissions. We do not talk about to end to explore oil, gas, or coal. We do not talk about the forests that are providing the global public good that is a stable climate. The solution was, let's keep the economic model as it is now, and we will try to produce less damage. This is what we have today. In the Paris Agreement, this is the center of climate policy that we have now. Please, the next slide, please. In the common concern of humankind, we still have the territorial approach to the planet. The planet is one territory divided between states where the commons are only the leftovers of the territorial divisions. The question is that this planet, the system of that sport life, do not care about the territorial divisions. It's a system, is a common good, is intangible, and exists in the real world. Without solving this question of recognizing that we have a common good that implies a common governance, that implies a common system of legitimacy, that implies common rules to manage its use, that implies to recognize that who are making benefits to the common good should be compensated, and that who are using the common good should pay for it, we will not probably find solutions. We have 25 years of negotiations without outcomes, and should be reasons for this. Please, the next slide. Try to think with me. If we all say that we will try to make less damage, in the end of the day, we have a negative sum game. Everyone can make less damage, but it is still being a damage. The next slide, please. If in the market, if someone do not make the emission, I will make the emission. I buy this emission and I will make the emission. It's a zero-sum game. The next slide, please. If I pay to someone that absorb the emission that I made, okay, in the end of the day, it's a neutral, it's a zero-sum game again. Please, again. The question is, the forests that are cleaning and absorbing CO2 for all the benefit of all humanity are cleaning in the legal void. You need to have the emissions for the work of nature to have value. Someone must make the emissions for that emissions to be paid to someone that will absorb the emission. And with this model, it's impossible to restore the Earth system. It's impossible to clean the climate. It's impossible to let a heritage for the next generation. What we will left for the next generation, it is a concern. Of course, it is a concern. Next slide, please. I have already explained, emissions must exist in order to recognize the value of removing the said emissions. Next slide, please. So let's try to link biodiversity with environmental services and law. Biodiversity produce ecosystem process that in turn produce environmental services. And these environmental services produce benefits. The great question is that these benefits, like producing a stable climate, today we talk about Amazon. Amazon is producing stable climate for all the planet. The question is, because the system itself does not exist for the law. Climate is not a common good. These benefits are spread all over the planet, and from a legal standpoint, these benefits disappear in a legal void. They do not exist for the law, and so the value of these services disappear also in this legal void. So, this is the concern approach. With the heritage approach, these benefits can be captured in the common heritage. If climate can be a common heritage, to produce benefits for the common good can be captured and become visible in the common heritage. And if they exist from a legal standpoint, they can also have visibility from an economic point of view. So to create what today we have talked, green economy, the economy of restoration, we need a legal support to restore a stable climate, to restore a well-functioning Earth system. Next slide, please. So the question is what we consider that is wealth creation in our society or not. During the history of our society and economics, the concept of value, the concept of what is wealth creation has always changed. Why can't we recognize the value of this process that supports life on Earth? That this is the value that really matters. Why can't I have one economy that is able to restore the Earth system and we work for this? But to do this and to have collective action, we need a legal framework where all these efforts do not disappear in the legal void. We cannot expect, as Einstein explained, different results if we continue to do the same thing. This evolution can be one of the things that can be discussed in Stockholm+50, that can be discussed in the summit of the future that it's foreseen for 2023. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Paulo, for this outstanding overview of how the Earth System Law works and what is the value that can be provided by, considering the services and the goods that the Earth provides. So it's really interesting because it complements the approach that Sepra Berman has said that on the one hand, we need to stop proliferating in fossil fuels. And on the other hand, we need to start giving value to the work of nature. So I think it's very complementary and fits really well, to make these, approaches more, harmonize with each other. One of the questions we've gotten from the audience is, we've all talked about different changes that need to happen. That we need to enforce certain rights, that we need to recognize rights to people, that we need to stop proliferating fossil fuels, and we need to give value to the work and services of nature. But the question is, if such a change happens in one given country, how can we stop it from being overturned by a succeeding government? Because we've recently had this with the Trump administration overturning all that, or half of what has been done by the Obama administration before in the United States. So I think the question is more of a legal nature. How can the law stop, these changes from being overturned by, succeeding governments? Jan, would you be able to answer this question?
Well, this is a governance gap that I briefly touched upon. Because right now we see in the Netherlands that our government is not living up to the obligations under the Urgenda Supreme Court ruling. So this will be the first time in our history that a government ignores a Supreme Court ruling. And this is also why I plea for more rules in relation to business and human rights, also for managers. So get this into the economic education system, so that a manager, and this is law in the Netherlands, not only knows that when he is a lousy entrepreneur and leaves a company bankrupt, that he has to pay from his personal money, has to pay the creditors of the company, but also that he learns that he has to do the same when his company violates human rights or hurts the environment. So there's a huge governance gap there. And these are the people that are working on this daily. And they also say this, I act according to the law. What I learn, I do. So we cannot trust on the values of those business directors who have to deal with daily numbers, 3 weekly reporting, pressure to get a profit. So this must be in the system there as well. And I fully agree. This is something that I've been talking for many years. The countries with the most beautiful laws often have lousiest implementation. So a beautiful constitution proclaiming rights for everyone and the right to a healthy and clean environment for present and future generations. And other countries try to make the most of it. And maybe last but not least, but I really want to mention, and I haven't yet, is the Finnish lawmaking process. Because in our lawmaking process, this should also be integrated. And they, regardless of the political parties in power, every 2 or 3 weeks, they sit down and they look, is this law that was adopted by Parliament, is it good for Finland and the future for Finland? They call it the Committee for the Future. And if we get this into our systems, so in the lawmaking process, but also into how NGOs, how businesses, how official government organizations plan their work and take future generations into that, the world will become a greener, more sustainable place with more justice.
And that's a very beautiful end note on which to end this question. It's your answer was very clear, and I hope the listener who asked the question has gotten their answer. We've got 2 additional questions. I'll target the first one at Tsepra Berman. Tsepra, we've got a question. Usually summits create commitments and about how governments want to cut subsidies or add or put money into that sector or that sector. There's also the question of corporate actors capturing these commitments. So how can we prevent, or how can we balance the corporate influence with a civil society influence in these international forums?
It's a good question. I think part of it is consistency in leadership around these issues in every forum. And what I mean by that is we need to be having this conversation about about ensuring absolute emissions reductions and production decline. whether it is in net zero forums, with businesses, with governments, in all of those forums. Right now, the net zero conversation globally is providing a cover for the expansion of fossil fuel production, because of the modeling and the math that takes into consideration unrealistic nature carbon sequestration, as well as technological sequestration. We need all of those things, but we have to get to zero first. And that's what the math is showing us. And so we can't allow the net zero conversation to justify continued expansion of production. So partially it's holding the corporate sector to account under strict rules that don't allow that, and not accepting the commitments that are being made today by the Net Zero Banking Alliance and others that continue to allow fossil fuel expansion. But I think the larger issue is around, good organizing. It's why we created, in part, the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative as a global campaign, because together we're greater than the sum of our parts. And although we have a growing divestment movement around the world, which is incredibly important, we need financial leadership. We honestly haven't had a movement call to governments on climate ambition since Paris. And so we're asking our governments to increase ambition, to do the stock take for better NDCs in the run up to Paris. First of all of that conversation, the public doesn't really understand. You ask a person walking on the street what an NDC is, they're not going to know. And so we need to be good organizing, and civil society power is about accumulative power. It's about numbers. It's about people marching in the streets and having a clear demand to governments, stopping the expansion of the bad stuff, of fossil fuel projects, and putting all of our money and effort into building solutions at this moment in history is something that people can understand. And I think that's why this campaign is so important. And I have one final comment on the previous question, which is just that I get a lot of governments saying, well, this government would never agree to that, or this government would never join a treaty. So, or if we stop fossil fuel expansion, this government over here will do more fossil fuel expansion. So why do it? If we thought like that when we were fighting the growing hole in the ozone layer, we would never have banned CFCs. If we thought like that when we were creating the chemical weapons treaty, or the landmine treaty, or the nuclear treaty, we would never have made any progress. I think this moment in history is about leadership, and the journey matters. And individual countries proposing and stepping up to the plate, like Denmark has just done when they committed to no new oil and gas expansion. That has an impact. It has an impact on the international debate. It has an impact on other countries. And what I've learned from studying the other treaties is that the journey matters. And just proposing a fossil fuel treaty, I think, is already creating new ambition and new conversations, which will lead to some bilateral and eventually multilateral discussions. So I think these so far are just excuses to allow countries to continue to expand at a moment when we can't afford it.
Thank you. That's very enlightening. It's I think the rules or the criteria that you set are very interesting in terms of what we need to do. We need good leadership, we need consistency, we need good organizing, and we need strict rules. So we got a similar question that's about clientelism, and I think that's a question that Najat Saliba is very fit to answer, given that we both come from a country where clientelism is the rule. So we have a lot of listeners who come from country where it's also a problem. So from your experience, what are the, I wouldn't say best practices, but what are the tools or the lessons that you could give to people around the world who are fighting the same problem of clientelism?
If I could pick up where Zepra left about being all responsible for production of fossil fuel. One thing our part of the world, or our similar governments who are receiving humanitarian aids, maybe the first thing they could do is that no humanitarian aids for fossil fuel anymore, or for importing old technology should be put in place. I mean, we shouldn't be importing old technology and burn more fossil fuels in here. Sorry about the electricity. And so, so this is one problem. The second about clientelism, it's extremely important to break the cycle of clientelism when we keep relying on humanitarian aids and financial aids to come up from our economic distress and economic problems, and sometimes also civil society problem. And for us to break the cycles of clientelism, we believe in the common good, and we believe in the empowerment of the local communities. And so I always go back to humanitarian aids of one size fits all, showering down on us solutions that come out from the global north, which I also hate as a word because in itself it has connotation. We need the context matter. We need to start solving our problems here within the same context that they exist in. And we need to find solutions that do not rely on fossil fuel and do not rely on emissions. And believe me, our governments who probably do not produce oil, they are capable of producing lots of pollution in the air. And they are part of the equation, and they have to be put in place. They have to be part of the discussion, and they have to be held accountable for everything they're doing. Because the pollution that is produced here for not regulating any emission is as bad as other places.
Thank you. Thank you again, Najat, for bringing us this boots on the ground testimony of what's going on. And it's especially enlightening given the fact that the electricity just turned off at the same time that you were saying this. There's a common trend in Lebanon usually. We have a third question that's to Paulo Magalhães. And Paulo, you've talked a lot about the value that nature brings us and the services of nature. And you talked about how we can move forward by defining climate not just as a concern, but also as a common heritage. So how can we define and measure this common good, the stable climate, given that it spreads across borders? Which aspects of climate can really be considered as a common heritage?
Here, it's one question that is made in international law for several times, and I think science, with the Planet Boundaries framework, finally can measure what is a well-functioning Earth system. A stable climate is a manifestation of a well-functioning Earth system. So when in international documents talk about the support of life or the wealth environment, this is an undefined concept and still being an undefined concept. But now, with the planetary framework, we have a set of indicators that measure what is the safe operating space for humankind. So this is always a woman representation of reality that we can bring of law or not. You understand? So this space is an intangible space, is not a territorial space. When science defines the safe operating space of humankind, it's not referring to a territory. It's not referring to the high sea or the seabed or Antarctica. No. It's referring to the quality of the system. And this quality that has always indicators that have maximums and minimums is our space of where we, humanity, can operate in safety. So if we give legal recognition to these indicators as an intangible space that corresponds to a pattern of well-function of that system, we can define the common good that unite us all and to which we all are part of. And this can be the basis for organizing our relationships that use this space. And all of us depend on this space. And this is the most important and the most value good of humanity. Without this space in the wealth function, there is no value, that we cannot produce value in our society. It's a question of survival, as Will Stephen very well explained. There is no economic analysis, cost-benefit analysis that can help us. So it's a question. We have already other intangible goods in the law, for example, the copyright law or the brands that have more value, the brand, than the material thing. Okay? So these are concepts already in law that support our economy, that support our society. And I think this is the time to recognize the difference between this planet and other planets is the system. The other planets do not have a system like we have here on Earth. And for the law, the only thing that value is the territory. The system does not exist. And now we have the scientific tools to define what is the software that should work to support life on Earth. Okay, I hope I answer your question.
Thank you, Pora. I think it answers it very well. You've been very comprehensive in your answer. We have a fourth question that's addressed to Cepra Berman. It's about how the mechanism and the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty work. So the question is, many of the high carbon emitting countries are developing ones, supplying for the demands of those who consume. Do you think that a fair regulation should be consumption-based rather than production-based? So it's a question of, should we regulate fossil fuel at the level of consumption or at the level of production?
Thank you. It's a great question. I think the fact is that the moment that we're in, given the urgency, requires both. You know, I can't remember the name of the famous economist that once said trying to cut a dangerous product with just one side of the scissors would never work, that demand and supply are both sides of the scissors. And I think if you look at other products in history, tobacco, many others, that of course we needed to regulate the supply as well as reduce demand and address consumption. And in this case, we need to do that as well. The production gap report released today shows that we need at minimum a 6% decline in production a year, but we're on track to increase production 110% beyond what we could ever burn. So we're going to need some serious cuts in both production and consumption if we're going to keep the world below 2 degrees. And the next decade matters. The other thing that I think is critical and why I focus on production is that the infrastructure that we put in today, the billions of dollars that we spend for a pipeline or a new coal mine or a new oil sands facility, the infrastructure is not built for 5 or 10 years. It's built for 20 to 40 years. And so it's absolutely critical that we stop that overbuild today, or we're locking in further emissions in the future. So we can't simply address consumption. Our math, our analysis are not good enough to ensure that that will constrain production and lock in. But also we need all the tools in our toolbox today, because every ton of carbon matters. Every ton of carbon at this point will save lives.
Yes, I think we have Jan de Venis who wants to take the floor to further on in this question, I believe.
Yeah, just a small comment, because I fully agree with Cepora. I mean, there is no time to wait, but I think there's also the element of historic emissions and the element of people in countries like the country where I live that have no clue on what their international CO2 emission is. So after COVID, we are opening up, and now the power plants in China, coal-fired, are pumping up. They're starting to produce more for us. So then we pinpoint to China and say, what are you doing? You're producing more CO2. No, I am producing more CO2 because of what I use here. And this is something that Jan Juffermans, he may be listening as well. From a human rights angle, there should also be maybe a new approach that looks at the fair share. We should all have a fair share of our planet. And there's a historic element in that, but there's also a future element in that. And underdeveloped countries should have some room to get up to the level of where we are. We should make more of an effort. We should act quicker because we have the means, we have more money, we have the technology, and we have contributed to the problem most. And then with I mean the most northern or western or most developed countries. But those are actually the countries who are against everything. So there I go with Sephora and say there's just no time to have that discussion without already starting to cut down on our emissions. And because otherwise we just screw it up for our future generations. We probably already have. They will deal with a lot of issues in the future. And many people on our planet, so it's a global equity issue as well. Many indigenous, the poor and the women and the children in undeveloped countries are suffering the most right now of emissions of the past of the more richer countries. So definitely there's a bigger responsibility for richer countries to step up and speed up this process. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think there's a link here to be made between like what we need to do and what is fair and who should bear what burden. So I think that's a very important thing to highlight, Jan. Thank you. We've got one final question, which is asked by Leida Reinhardt from the audience, and it's about, what if we create all these rules and we have all the rules that we want, etc., but we would still lack, a mechanism of enforcement for these rules. So how do we tackle the issue of enforcing environmental law and all these legislations and proposals that we have? I don't know who wants to answer that question, but perhaps Paulo.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, please. For me, the question of enforcing, for some reason, until now, we haven't been able to enforce. Because, collective action can only happen when we have in place the conditions for it to be possible to act collectively. In international law, no one can impose rules to other sovereignty. So the only way is to create a system where everyone, to change the games of the rule, that everyone will act in a different way. This is very well explained by Eleanor Ostrom when she said, nobody will be the second. So the only way to change my behavior is when I start to understand what will be the behavior of the other. If, in this case, if we have a common heritage, if we understand what were the historic contributions of each one for the common good, what are the positive contributions of each one for the state of that good, the congruence between the rules of appropriation and the provision of global public good, you can understand what is at game. And unfortunately, the countries that have more historic responsibilities are not the same countries that have the best ecosystems. So this is one opportunity to build the equity and to find one agreement. We only find solutions if we have equity, and the implementation and enforcement can only achieve if that conditions are in place. Because no one will accept from the north, you pollute the air, you make the damage, and now we have these obligations. So the challenge is to build the conditions to everyone feel that their own interests are in place. The countries that are responsible for the damage to the common good to assume their own responsibilities and to make one agreement. I think this is the only way where implementation can be in place.
Thank you, Paolo. I think that pretty much answers the question in a very wide manner. We have one final question from Aditi Michel, which concerns how developed countries finance climate mitigation projects in developing countries. And it's a question that can be very narrow, but can also be very wide, and to be broadened to how do developed countries finance climate projects in developing countries, and how should they finance them? I think, Najat, you're well positioned to answer that question, given that it concerns, how should developed countries finance the energy transition of developing countries? What are the criteria? What should they do? What should they refrain from doing? The floor is yours.
Thank you. This is a very important problem that usually developed countries, out of goodwill, of course, they send all this money with a top-down approach, and also with fixed KPIs and fixed limited amount of time to actually implement the project. And then we go and we impose on the community some solutions that worked well in those developed countries, and definitely are out of context, and they don't relate to the people and to their problems that are on the ground. And plus, with the limited time and the limited KPIs that they give, the people who are implementing the projects, they want to rush into basically fulfilling the conditions of this project so that they can get another project. And so we have a trust issue here that is extremely important, because we have many projects that have cost millions of dollars. They have implemented major infrastructure, but this, machines or equipments or all of these tools were never turned on, because the people completely detached from those top-down approaches, and they don't have any relation with them. So we have a trust issue here because of the limited amount of time, and we also have a solution that is completely out of context. And this is what I'm trying to say when I say that we decided to forget about all the top-down approaches and to forget about all the mandates that come from outside. We decided to go without any funding, but only listen to what the people need and to understand the struggle of the local community. And with our projects that are going on the ground, we don't implement any mandate from outside. We go to the community, we listen to them, and we understand from them what are their issues. And together with the community, we start working on solutions and even look for sources of funding. The most important thing that we have found, a great response from the community is that they know that we are here, and our mandate or our presence in the community is not going to finish when the grant finishes. And we take our time. The time that the grantee gives to the grant to be implemented is not the time that the community would like to work with. And this is extremely important. So the community needs its own time, and this cannot be locked into 1 or 2 years. So sometimes a very, very simple project can take few months, and in some other places, even if it is the same exact project, it takes 1 year. So we really have to understand the readiness of the community and work with them and respect their own time and their own pace in order for us to implement solutions. So I think this funding mechanism that has been implemented obviously has not come to a positive conclusion or successful conclusions all the time. Don't get me wrong, in some cases it has helped, but those one-size-fits-all top-down solutions are basically, they have created more waste and more emissions than that they have solved.
Thank you. That really brings out I want to say, the dark side of climate finance, in a sense that you very often account for certain finance that's given to certain projects and that goes into climate budgets, which fits into the Paris Agreement target of $100 billion that are supposed to be provided by developed countries. And it's good to know that it doesn't often happen as should happen, and that a real alternative to this is to have community-based projects and community-led projects as you do. So this was the final question for tonight. I'd like to thank you all the participants, Najat, Jan, Tsepera, Paolo. It's been an amazing roundtable. I've rarely partaken in roundtables where there's such a breadth, a diversity of perspectives, and such an orientation to solutions. Very often in the environmental sphere, we tend to stay on the level of diagnosis, but we don't go into the depth of the solutions. And it's very good that we've all proposed, you all have proposed different solutions to different problems, which I believe could and should be taken into account into the upcoming declaration and Stockholm+50 process next year. So perhaps on that note, we could close this panel. And I hope to thank all the participants to today's session. And we hope to see you all tomorrow at 2 p.m. Central European Time for the continuation of the summit. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.